Clicking. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nicole Miller, she, her, hers, president of IATSE Local B192, and I'm proudly joining Desi Cole from Local 728 today to co-host this GLAAD Trans 101 training. We're very excited to be doing this. About 3 years ago, I attended this training when Local 728 hosted it. And when it was over, my first thought was that this absolutely needed to be shared with as many people as possible. So now it is with great pleasure and pride that we are doing just that. So without further delay, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed trainers. Nick Adams is the Director of Transgender Representation at GLAAD. He is a resource for media content creators who are telling stories about transgender people. He has consulted on hundreds of films and TV shows, as well as video games and Broadway shows, to assist in creating authentic transgender characters and stories. He works closely with network executives, showrunners, writers, casting directors, actors, and PR teams. Nick is also a consulting producer on the Netflix documentary Disclosure, and he appears in the film, which, by the way, I highly recommend. Add it to your Netflix list ASAP if you haven't seen it. Nick joined GLAAD in 1998 and transitioned himself at that time. Scott Turner Schofield is senior consultant for GLAAD and founder of the consulting company Speaking of Transgender. The first out trans man to earn an Emmy nomination for an acting role, Scott was also the first out trans actor in daytime television, recurring on CBS's The Bold and the Beautiful. He received international critical acclaim for his starring role in the 1920s period film The Conductor, and his one-man show special premiered at the 2020 Tribeca Film Festival. Between acting gigs, Scott consults on transgender storylines, including HBO Max's unscripted shows We're Here and Legendary, and the Blumhouse reboot of The Craft. Most notably, the role he helped create on HBO's Euphoria has been called TV's most interesting trans character and the future of TV. Nick and Scott, we welcome and thank you both. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you, Desi. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us here today. Oh, Scott's vanished again because the way this presentation is going to work is we have a PowerPoint to show you, and I'm going to do the first half, and Scott's going to do the second half. So I'll show some slides, and then I'll stop screen sharing, and Scott can show some slides. And this, I was so excited when Desi asked us to present to IATSE 3 years ago, almost exactly, because this issue of like transgender workplace issues and making all workplaces more trans inclusive is becoming more and more of an important issue, and those workplaces include sets. So actually, since Scott and I did this presentation 3 years ago for the local here in Los Angeles, we've ended up doing it both in person and virtually for many, many, many shows going into production that have transgender and non-binary cast members, sometimes writers and showrunners as well, but oftentimes cast members. And what's been really wonderful is that in the same way that when we did this presentation in Burbank, I think it was that right, Desi? Burbank? Yeah. 3 years ago, many trans and non-binary IATSE members came to the presentation. We've also learned that when we do it virtually for productions in Toronto or New York or Atlanta or here in LA, that we end up having people reach out to us afterwards who are trans and non-binary crew members and thank us for the presentation. So we always are aware when we do this that it's about a lot more than just the actor that's in front of the camera. It's also everybody on the set who may represent gender diversity. So we're so thrilled to be able to come and talk to you about this today. And I'm going to start screen sharing. Give me a second. So what we're going to do today is that prior to talking about a gender diverse workplace and having trans and non-binary coworkers, we're going to back up a little bit and do a Trans 101, which is this. I do this for every presentation that I do because you can't really talk about storytelling when you are very vague on the concept of what it means to be trans and non-binary. You can't really talk about workplace issues, same thing. So we always like to do a level set for everyone in the meeting on some basic fundamental ideas about gender diversity and what it means to be trans and non-binary. So I'm going to do that part. And then when I finish, Scott's going to come back and talk more about the workplace specific issues. So thank you so much for spending time on a Sunday with us today. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, GLAAD is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1985, largely in response to really homophobic coverage of the AIDS crisis. Then the following year, we established a chapter in Los Angeles to begin working with Hollywood to improve the way all forms of media tell stories about LGBTQ people. And I think for the first 10 years or so of GLAAD's existence, the media thought of GLAAD as the media watchdog group of the LGBTQ movement. But for the vast majority of the time I've been at GLAAD, which shockingly is 23 years, our mission has really shifted to be more of a resource to media content creators to help them do a good job of telling LGBTQ stories. Nobody wants to really do media watchdogging for a living. We just want better stories. And we want also more diverse and inclusive workplaces as well, which has become so much more of a conversation over the last 3 to 5 years, I would say. So why are workplaces becoming more gender diverse? Well, the world is changing. Believe it or not, I was shocked to find out that over 50% of the American population right now is either millennial or Gen Z. So over 50% of the American population as a whole is under 40. And you can see the ages there for Gen Z and the millennial generations. And they are just becoming a much bigger part, not only of like being media consumers, but also being coworkers in your workplace. And they've been asking this question of Americans for many, 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 many years. Do you consider yourself part of the LGBTQ community? Do you call yourself LGBTQ? And you can see there how the percentage has risen just over the last 8 years. So, more significantly after we got the marriage equality decision, I think in 2015. And I think that the reason that that number is going up and up and up is because we're making the world a better, more safe place for people to be able to say, yes, I am LGBTQ. I don't think actually there's more LGBTQ people. I think we're just making the world in which people who are LGBTQ are able to actually say yes when somebody asks them that question on a survey. And so that number is currently now 5.6% of people say that they are LGBTQ. But that's everybody, all Americans polled by Gallup. If you look at just Gen Z, so this poll looked at the older Gen Z, right? 18 to 23, not the younger Gen Z that are still like 9 to 17. But even in that 5-year gap of 18 to 23 of Gen Z, and you say, are you part of the LGBTQ community? The number, instead of being 5.9%, is 15.9%, or 5.6% to 15.9% of Gen Z says, yes, I'm part of the LGBTQ community. And then another 5% decline to state. So less than 80% of Gen Z say they are strictly heterosexual and not transgender. So Gen Z is a generation that's growing up being just much more comfortable with saying that they are part of the LGBTQ community. And of this Gen Z age range, 1.8% say that they call themselves transgender. So that doesn't seem like a huge number necessarily, 1.8%, but it's much larger than any estimate of transgender people that has been made previously. And it's about the same number of people that have red hair. It's about the same number of people that are Mormon. So while it might be a small number, it's not an inconsequential amount of people. It's quite a few people. You've probably met people with red hair and people who are Mormon. So, we exist in Gen Z for sure. And as they become more likely to be your coworkers graduating from college, they're going to bring all of that sexual orientation and gender diversity into the workplace. But trans people still face employment discrimination. So if you are a transgender person the transgender community as a whole has an unemployment rate that's 3 times the general population's unemployment rate. If you're a trans person of color, it's 4 times the national unemployment rate. 77% of transgender people report taking steps in the workplace to avoid anti-trans discrimination. And that sometimes can mean not talking about being trans in the workplace, not delaying your transition because you don't want to face repercussions in the workplace, not asking employers to use the right pronouns because you don't want to cause trouble and you're afraid of being fired. And there is no stated federal law that protects LGBTQ people from discrimination in employment. Last year, we got the Bostock decision, which said that Title VII prevents discriminating against us in employment. But until that decision, there were no protections for us. So discrimination still exists. And when you don't have a trans inclusive workplace and you don't have trans inclusive policies, it can lead to greater turnover in the workforce. And just generally, we're living in a culture right now which is using transgender people as this wedge issue to stir up the culture wars about what our right to exist. So this last 6 months actually was the most anti-trans legislative year on record, with over 100 anti-trans bills introduced in over 30 states, 9 of them passed actually that banned trans girls from playing sports, and 1 passed that banned trans youth from getting healthcare. So we're living in a world right now in which gender diversity is increasing, but there is a backlash as well from certain forces in this culture that are targeting transgender people for discrimination. So I've already used like a million words. What do they all mean? Well, let's start with this acronym LGBT. So yes, there's a Q and a whole lot of other letters at the end of it, but for the purposes of this pretty slide, I'm just going to talk about LGBT. So it's this acronym that we use to describe our community, and we're always going to use this acronym because we are one community. For the last 120 years, we've been put into the same research studies, we've been put into the same bars, the same marginalized spaces. So we are, and the people who hate us, really, they hate us for all the same reasons. They don't really differentiate between us. But the fact is, this acronym is a little confusing because lesbian, gay, and bisexual is who you're attracted to, who you fall in love with, who you spend the rest of your life with. And gender identity is who you are on the inside. Are you a man? Are you a woman? Or are you non-binary? And this acronym LGBT confuses and conflates for many people these two issues. So it's important to remember that like transgender people have sexual orientations too. So I'm a transgender man, but I'm also a gay man. So I've been with my husband, John, for 20 years. If I was attracted to women, I would be a straight man. If I was attracted to all genders, I'd be a bisexual man. My sexual orientation is based on who I am now, not the sex that I was assigned at birth. So first things first, before we talk about anything else, just remember in your mind that LGB and T are two separate things. And many of you on this call may already know that. But if keep in mind that others that you interact with, for many people, they still do tend to confuse and conflate sexual orientation and gender identity. So what we're going to talk about today is the T in LGBT. And it's important because while gender diversity is increasing, if you ask Americans today, do you personally know someone who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual? 90% of Americans say yes. They personally know someone in their family, their friends, their workplace, their neighborhood, their church, their school, who is lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So whatever they see on film and TV about LGBT people, they can actually compare to LGBT people they know in their real life. This was not the case when GLAAD was founded. Back in 1985, probably most Americans didn't think that they'd met a lesbian or a gay person, but now a lot has changed in 36 years. But if you ask people, do you personally know someone who's transgender in your family, your friends, your workplace, your neighborhood, your church, your school, only about 31% of Americans say yes, they've met us. 70% of Americans think they've never met someone trans. Now, they may have met us and just not known it, but they don't think that they've met us. More Americans say that they've seen a ghost than say that they've met a transgender person. So for 70% of Americans, everything they know about being transgender, they've learned from film and TV, which is really not a good thing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But it's their heads are filled with these really kind of not great representations of trans people that we've all grown up watching. So it's really, really important that we tell better stories about trans people so that those 70% of people who think they've never met us have a better idea in their heads of what it means to be trans and will behave in better ways when they do actually meet trans people in their workplace, their church, their neighborhood, their school. So if you take that 31% number, though, of all Americans who say, yes, I've met a trans person, and 70% who say, no, I haven't. If you look at it by age, again, you can see how the world is changing. Americans under 30, 50% of them say they've met a trans person in real life. So 1 out of 2. And that yes, blue pie slice gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller the older that you go up in age. But for young people, not only are they more likely to be LGBTQ, more likely to say that they're part of the trans community, they're also more likely to have family members and friends who are trans and who are going to want to see us represented in media and be in the workforce. Okay, so what does it mean to be trans? This is a very complicated topic, and this is the simplest, fastest way I know to describe something complicated. And some of you on this Zoom call are trans. Some of you are in that 31% who have trans friends and family members. And some of you may be like, what does that word mean again? And how does that relate to non-binary? So the goal of this next section is just to explain to you in the simplest possible way something very complicated. And if you already know it, you can think of this as a train the trainer section where you can use these same concepts to explain it to other people in a simple way. But where I'm going to start is with these 3 spectrums, because many, many people if you took high school biology, let me start again. Many people took high school biology. And in high school biology, you learn that if you have XX chromosomes, you're a woman. And if you have XY chromosomes, you're a man. And most people's understanding of like sex and biology and gender sort of stops there. And it shouldn't surprise you to learn that high school biology is not the end all be all of these matters. So instead of thinking in terms of a binary of anything, we're going to look at spectrums and we're going to talk about three different things. So the top spectrum there is biological sex. And biological sex is determined by your chromosomes, but not solely your chromosomes. Those have to work together with genes, with also estrogen and testosterone, which we all have in our bodies, just in differing amounts, and then cell receptors for those hormones that have to be able to process them. And those four things work together to make up a body that is made up of internal reproductive organs and external genitalia and secondary sex characteristics. All of it has to work together to make this biological body that we have. And it is not binary. So that word in the middle, intersex, replaces the old, outdated, now considered offensive word hermaphrodite. And that word intersex describes people who have a biological body that does not neatly fall into the male or female extremes of this spectrum. It is about 1.7% of people are born with an intersex trait. And that can include things like having XXY chromosomes. It can include things like having XY chromosomes, but the cell receptor in your body that's supposed to take in the testosterone, the receptors aren't there. So the testosterone just bounces off, which means that XY body develops as female. It's very common to have an intersex trait. 1.7% of people, again, is not an inconsequential number of people. So biological sex, even this thing that we believe is 1,000% binary, like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west and must truly be true, is not a binary. It's actually much more complicated than that. And we're not going to talk about intersex trait issues today because I don't have an intersex trait. There is an amazing group called Interact that does this work for people with intersex traits. But I raise it to point out that this thing that people believe is 1,000% binary is absolutely not. The second spectrum there is gender identity. So gender identity is an internal sense of self. Like you look inside yourself and you say, am I a man? Am I a woman? Or do neither one of those terms fit me? And if neither one of those terms fit you when it comes to your gender identity, the word people use today tends to be non-binary, meaning I am not one of your two binary choices. So gender identity is invisible to others. I can't look at you and see your gender identity. You can't look at me and see my gender identity. It's an invisible trait, but that doesn't mean it's not real. So as I mentioned before, gender identity and sexual orientation are two separate things. But if you think about it, sexual orientation is also an invisible trait. Like you look inside yourself and you say, am I heterosexual? Am I gay? Am I lesbian? Am I bi? You know the answer, even though you can't see your sexual orientation or no one else can see it. You just know that it's true. Gender identity is similar, that you look inside yourself and you know what's true, even if other people can't see it. And then the third spectrum down there is gender expression. So if gender identity is entirely invisible and other people can't see it, gender expression is entirely visible. It's all the cues you send off to people every single second of every single day about what your gender is. So it starts with names because some names are very, very gendered, like Frank and Melissa. And other names like Chris or Alex or Pat are those names where you're not really sure what gender someone is until you get more data about them. Pronouns are a way that we gender people. So if I say he went to the store or she went to school, I'm telling you, and you assume that a man went to the work, what store, and a woman went to school. So that's how pronouns work as a gendering expression device. But the other things that we talk about being masculine or feminine tend to be like, do you have long hair? Do you have short hair? Do you wear makeup? Do you not wear makeup? Do you wear jewelry? Do you paint your fingernails? Do you wear suits and ties or do you wear dresses? We look at people and we read those cues and we make a snap decision about their gender just by looking at them. This is what happens at the airport when you walk up to the TSA scanner. They look at you, make an assumption about your gender based on what they see and push a man or a woman button on their side of the scanner that looks at your body when you put your hands up. This was the dumbest idea that anyone ever had because it's actually not that easy or possible to assume someone's gender based on what you see, but that's what we think. So these gender expression cues, I put gender nonconforming in the middle. You could also put androgynous, and I'm going to talk in a minute about how some people might also put non-binary there. But these gender expression cues, they are made up by society. We make these cues up. They change over time, but they are also rigidly enforced. You know when you violate, like what is considered masculine for a man and what is considered feminine for a woman. Society lets you know. So even though they're socially constructed, doesn't mean they're not enforced. And I also want to say that like everyone on this call right now, you can place yourselves on these three spectrums. They're not just for trans people. But if you are not a trans person, you're probably placing yourself more or less on the ends. And these three things might all seem flat to you, like they're one thing. Like looking through three panes of glass and they're all clean and perfectly lined up, and it just looks like one pane of glass. But if you are a transgender person, who you know and you are on the inside, what your gender identity is, does not match what the doctor wrote on their birth certificate and does not match what people see when they look at you in those gender expression cues. And that feeling of incongruence between who you know and you are on the inside, what people see when they look at you, and what you see when you look down in the shower, is this feeling of like incongruence. It's like a feeling of not being seen. It's not a very pleasant feeling, to be honest. And the other way in which gender identity is similar to sexual orientation, even though they're different, is that in the same way you cannot go to a therapist and be talked into being straight if you're actually gay, you can't go to a therapist and be talked into having your gender, changing your gender identity to match what the doctor wrote on the birth certificate. It just seems to be a fixed innate trait. So if you're a person who has this feeling of incongruence between your gender identity and these other two spectrums, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, every trans person ever agrees that the way to resolve that feeling of incongruence is to change the gender expression cues and possibly change the body to match the gender identity, because you can't do it the other way. And it's important to note that like not everybody who wants to find congruence for themselves on these three spectrums is going from one extreme of the spectrum to the other extreme of the spectrum. Some people do, but for most transgender people, the steps that they're going to take to find congruence for with their gender identity on these other two spectrums is going to be very unique to them. These steps that people take to find congruence are called transition. That's all transition is finding congruence with your gender identity with your gender expression and your biological sex. And so because everybody's going to take different steps to find congruence for themselves, everybody's transition is going to be unique. There is no one way to transition. There's just the way to transition that is right for you. And I've already said almost everything on this slide. So I'm going to skip down to the cause of the incongruence is unknown. So we don't know why some people have a gender identity that doesn't match what the doctor wrote on their birth certificate, in the same way that we don't know why some people are lesbian, gay, and bisexual and other people are straight. It just seems to be one of nature's variations. But we do know that it's not new. There have always been transgender people throughout time and in every culture around the world. That's not the word that they used, but it is the way that they lived their lives was very similar. So in the same way that the word homosexual didn't exist for Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman doesn't mean they weren't gay. Just because people didn't use the word transgender back then doesn't mean that they weren't also trying to find congruence for themselves with their gender identity in the past and in other countries. We don't know how many transgender people there are because studies are not, surveys are not constructed in a way that counts us very well. But based on the few that have tried, UCLA estimates that there are 1.4 million transgender Americans. I think that number is really low based on the growing amount of gender diversity that I showed you on the prior slides. And also, as we create a more accepting culture, more people are going to be able to say that they're trans. But if that is the right number today, and we all live together in one place, we would be America's 8th largest city. So we would be about the size of San Diego. So sometimes I would get the question here, like, well, when do you become transgender? Like, is it when you have the surgery? And the answer to that is definitely not. So you know you're transgender when you know you're transgender. Like the moment that you realize that your gender identity is not what people think it is, you can call yourself transgender if you want to. You don't have to tell anyone else to make it real. You don't have to do anything else to make it real. The best analogy I can give you is that you can be a young gay boy and know that you're gay years before you actually kiss another boy. You can know that you're trans when the moment you realize, oh, everybody thinks I'm a girl, but I look at my gender identity and I know that I'm not a girl. And then you can call yourself trans. But if you do choose to take those transition steps for yourself to find congruence with that gender identity, you can think of transition in like 3 different buckets. There's social transition, which is like change your name, change your pronoun, change the way you dress. There's medical transition, which is change the body with hormone replacement therapy and or surgeries. And there's legal transition, which is jump through a million hoops to try to change that gender marker on a cajillion documents. Let me tell you, it is hell. So again, transgender people are going to take some of these steps and not others. They're going to do them in any order that feels right to them. There is no one way to transition or nothing that you do that magically makes you trans. You're trans if you know you're trans. And I want to talk a little bit more briefly about non-binary gender identities because it is so much in the zeitgeist right now. People are very confused about it for a variety of reasons. So I said that the word non-binary is in that middle spectrum for gender identity. Like you look inside yourself and you say, am I a man? Am I a woman? Or do neither one of those terms fit me? And if somebody is using the word non-binary in that way, then they will also call themselves part of the transgender community because their gender identity is different from what the doctor wrote on their birth certificate. So many non-binary people call themselves transgender. I think that this word came along about 5 years ago. Prior to that, in the trans community, I've always known people whose gender identity wasn't binary since I transitioned. But they used to use the words like genderqueer and gender fluid. And then when this word non-binary came along, everybody was like, we love that word. Let's call ourselves that. And genderqueer and gender fluid still exist. They just kind of faded into the background as non-binary became the more prominent and common way to describe this experience and this way of being trans. And, I said before that pronouns are a gender expression marker. It's a cue. It's a way that we gender people. So what do you do if you're not a man or a woman and he, him, and she, her are only for men and women? The singular they is the way most non-binary people today ask to be referred to. So people get really tripped up because they is plural, but in fact, we use singular they all the time, every day in English. It's so second nature to us, we don't even realize we do it. It goes all the way back to Chaucer. If this were a meeting at the local in Burbank and we all got up to leave and there was a phone on the chair, a phone on the chair, I would look at this and I would say, someone left their phone here. I hope they come back and get it. We do singular they all the time. Don't even think about it. But when we do it like that, we're always talking about someone unknown to us. It takes more practice to remember to do it in regard to a specific person, like to say, Asia K. Dillon's a great actor. I hope they get an Emmy nomination for their work on Billions. That is the way you use singular they when you're referring to a specific person. And it takes more practice to remember and learn how to do that. But when you think about it, it's not that far from how we do it every day when we're talking about someone unknown to us. And Asia K. Dillon was one of the first trans non-binary actors to kind of bring this concept of being trans and non-binary into the public eye when they got cast on Billions. And therefore, it's not Asia K. Dillon's fault, but for humans, we look at one person of a marginalized community we're unfamiliar with, and we assume all people in that marginalized community must be like that one person. Human nature, not one of our best traits. So people leap to an assumption sometime, I think, that all non-binary people look like Asia K. Dillon, have a very androgynous gender expression like they do in this photo. But not all non-binary people are in the middle of that third masculine and feminine spectrum. Non-binary people can have any gender expression. And non-binary people may also choose to medically transition with hormones and possibly surgeries. That doesn't make them not non-binary. So the best way I can explain it to you is if a bisexual woman gets married to a man, that doesn't make her not bisexual. In the same way, a non-binary person may choose to take medical transition steps because that helps them feel better in their bodies, but that they can still have a non-binary gender identity. And so this slide really quickly just shows you that not all non-binary people look like Asia K. Dillon. But the only thing I don't love about these two pictures, is that because it's a story about Instagram, there aren't older people in these pictures. And I think that there's a misperception that being non-binary is somehow like a youth thing, like a phase, easy to dismiss it. It's just something young people do. But again, I've known non-binary people since I transitioned in 1998, and I know many non-binary people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's definitely not a youth phenomenon. So I've been talking about non-binary as if it's the same thing as trans. Is that actually the case? And the answer today is only sometimes. So I, for the longest time, had this misperception that all non-binary people considered themselves part of the trans community because that's where I knew the word came from. That's how Asia K. Dillon brought it into the mainstream. I was like, oh, if somebody says they're non-binary, that means they're trans. Got it. Cool. However, I started meeting all these content creators in Hollywood who were saying things to me like, oh, I'm not writing a trans character, I'm writing a non-binary character. And I was like, what? Why do you think that those are two separate things and totally unrelated to each other? These are both misperceptions. And the fact of the matter is, the reality is it's like a Venn diagram overlap. And I don't know about you, but I hated fifth grade math. So I don't do well with this. But the fact is, not all transgender people are non-binary, but some transgender people are non-binary. But there's a lot of people right now in the world who are calling themselves non-binary, but who do not mean that they're trans. So you have to, when you hear somebody say, I'm non-binary, the best thing I could tell you right now is that it's its own umbrella term in a sense. And you kind of have to listen very carefully and hear what else they say about what the word non-binary means to them. So the best way that I can illustrate this with actual faces, which I think makes it more concrete, is that everyone on the left is a non-binary celebrity and actor who calls themselves part of the transgender community. Some of them were assigned female at birth, some of them were assigned male at birth, some of them have medically transitioned, like Theo Germain and Garcia and India Moore. Others have not, like Elliot Page, Asia Kate Dillon, Quintessa Swindell, Bex Taylor Kloss, and Mason Alexander Park and Eddie Izzard down there at the bottom. But all these people and celebrities and actors on the right call themselves non-binary, but they either say, oh, I'm not transgender, I'm non-binary, as if those are two different things, or they just never mention the word transgender in relationship to themselves. And that is like Sam Smith and Nico Tortorella and Jonathan Van Ness and Jared Schnacko and Alex Newell and Miley Cyrus and Sara Ramirez and Demi Lovato and Liv Hewson. So I think what's happening is these people on the right, some of them are talking about their gender expression, like they are people assigned male at birth, like Sam and Nico and Jonathan, and they want to wear dresses on the red carpet. So they're talking about their gender expression and they're using the word non-binary to describe that. And for some of them, like I think Sara Ramirez and Demi Lovato and Liv Hewson and Miley Cyrus, it's non-binary is being used almost as a political statement. Like, I don't like the patriarchy, I don't like gender roles, I'm going to call myself non-binary. That's fine. I'm not the word police. And I'm also not like trying to say that these people on the right are not non-binary enough to be trans. That's not true. If anybody on the right put their hand up and said they were trans, I'd be like, great, come over to the other side of the slide. I'm just reflecting what they say about themselves. So just be cautious as you're working and knowing non-binary people to understand that for some people that word non-binary absolutely means they consider themselves part of the trans community, and other people do not consider it themselves part of the trans community. And I think it's confusing to have this one word that means both trans and not trans, but it's just the world we're in right now. And it's kind of the way in which that gender diversity is manifesting itself all around us. I think it's a quickly evolving cultural conversation. And if we have this talk 6 months from now or a year from now, maybe it'll have shaken out and there'll be different words. We just kind of have to pay attention to it in real time. And there's a million other terms. The GLAAD Media Reference Guide is a place that you can always go to have a lot more terms and definitions defined for you. We're also going to have a new edition this year, come hell or high water. But for now, this is available. And I briefly want to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to Scott, the Cellular Closet, Vito Russo was one of GLAAD's founders. And I think this book and the documentary that was made afterwards in the 90s was this way that taught a lot of people in Hollywood how Hollywood has portrayed lesbian, gay, and bi people over the years. And it was like Hollywood read this book and saw that documentary and woke up and went, oh, yes, well, we have been writing like the sissy gay man and the gay best friend and the predatory lesbian vampire and the suicidal lesbian and the promiscuous bisexual for decades. Maybe we should change that. And for the longest time, I really had hoped that there was some trans version of the Cellular Closet, but I was struggling. And then like 5 years ago, Sam Fader came to me and was like, hey, I think I want to make a documentary about trans representation in Hollywood. And I was like, thank the Lord. So this is on Netflix right now and executive produced by Laverne Cox, directed by Sam Fader. You can learn so much about trans people by watching this documentary, because by taking and concentrating into 1 hour and 47 minutes, the clips of transgender people in film and TV, going all the way back to D.W. Griffith, all the way through Pose, and interviewing 30 transgender people about the impact of those images and how it, like, there's a quote from the Cellular Closet that says, Hollywood, that great maker of myths, taught straight people what to think about gay people and taught gay people what to think about themselves. And you can just replace the word gay with the word trans and the same truth is true. So and it's not accurate and it's all false and lies. So if you watch Disclosure, I think you will be in 1 hour and 47 minutes. It'll help you unlearn the stereotypes about what it means to be trans and will help you, even if you don't personally know someone trans in your real life, have a more authentic and real idea in your head about what it means to be trans and help you also be a better ally to when you do meet the trans and non-binary people in your family or your workplace. And I think with that, if I remember my slides, yes, I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Scott, who will start screen sharing his slides.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get to my screen share. Come over here. And we'll go ahead and start. Magic. All right. So let's talk about the workplace that you're all a part of. we have to sort of start with, it's all about respect, right? Just as Nick really succinctly pointed out over there, we are set to make really snap judgments about what a person's gender is based on what they look like or what they sound like or what their name is. And this is getting harder and harder to do accurately and inclusively, as, like Nick pointed out, there are more and more and more people who are not fitting so neatly into boxes, and who are kind of resisting that, and who are, let's face it, feeling really free to be more themselves and to bring their whole selves to work. So we really have to kind of recognize that this is a thing, this is happening. This is Los Angeles, where we are right now in 2021, right? This is a cosmopolitan world. Diversity is the only reality. And whether we like it or not, this is just what it's going to be. So figuring out, like, okay, I truly believe that most people, probably 95% of people, really just want to be respectful to everybody and get on with their day and do their job and not get into power struggles about diversity, right? So how can we do that? Well, we got to think about it as just expanding the frame that we look through when we're talking about gender, especially, like, not assuming, in the same way that we no longer hopefully assume that everyone around us is heterosexual, right? That we also no longer assume that everyone around us is cisgender, right? There's no such thing as looking transgender. Neither Nick or I are people who, are assumed to be transgender when we move through the world. Most people are surprised when we tell them, and there are a lot of people like us. Also, just as Nick pointed out with non-binary folks, there are many folks who identify as non-binary who you wouldn't ever know to look at them, right? So we have to just recognize that this is a lot bigger than we think. It's a lot more common. And what is it for any of us to just sort of expand it a little bit? So how do you do that? Well, let's think about that. And more than anything, let's hold on to the fact that no matter how a person identifies, it doesn't change who they are or how they do their job. And I think that's the number one thing I really want to impress here is all of this training for you is about helping this whole conversation. If someone discloses to you that they are trans or non-binary, you just go, cool. Can you help me with this light? Right? Like that it's really not a big deal. That's what we're going for with all of this work. Part of respect in the workplace is never speculating about another person's identity, right? I think keeping work conversations focused on work is what's most important. And recognizing that when you are working with someone who is trans or non-binary, just because they're living a kind of very intimate identity out in the world, it doesn't give you license to have conversations about that. Again, especially at work. If this is someone who you think is really cool and you want to get to know them better and you want to be friends, like, you can build that relationship outside of work. You can take them out for dinner, right? You can ask them if it's okay if you ask them questions because you have, some curiosity, right? Like they may say no, because a lot of people are getting tired of answering very deep and personal questions to people they don't know very well, right? But really, it's important to recognize that the number one sort of foundation of respect here is really kind of not talking about it, not making it a big deal, not asking questions, especially not talking about a person's body, because when you're talking about trans people, often you're talking about secondary sex characteristics like breasts or genitals, and that is so not a conversation you want to be having at work anymore. It's also just an invasion of privacy. It's inappropriate. And now in California, according to the law, questions like these become harassment very, very quickly. So again, if you want to have a conversation, right, especially if a colleague begins their transition on the job, right, that is something that you have to negotiate outside of work, right? And something else that's important to recognize is, the media really loves to focus only on people who have just transitioned. So you might have heard that Elliot Page just transitioned. And we really love to focus on that moment because it's such a dramatic moment, this big shift in someone's life, right? It makes a good story. However, people like Nick and myself, we've both been out for 20 and over 20 years at this point. We both made our transitions a long time ago, and talking about it becomes something that we do less and less. It's not that we're not proud. It's not that we're not out. It's just that it kind of recedes into the background a little bit. And it certainly doesn't become something that we talk about with people while we're working, right? I mean, Nick and I may be a different example because this is our job, but but in other ways, right? It's not something that comes up, right? In quite the same way that lesbian and gay and bisexual and queer folks experience when they come up against things all the time, right? Like, you know, when someone asks, "Oh, who's your wife?" and someone has to say, "Well, my husband's name is," right? And they have to come out as gay over and over and over again. It's something that happens differently. It's one of the really key differences between trans people and gay, lesbian, bisexual folks and queer folks. Okay, so back to this respect piece. I've given you kind of a lay of the land of kind of the most fundamental piece. But again, this thing about names and pronouns is so key to respect. Okay, if someone changes their name who you've known for a very long time, you're going to have to have a transition yourself. And if they also change their pronouns, you're going to have to transition that yourself. I'm going to tell you that is going to be difficult, but when you add this idea of sort of like that it's this huge thing, that transition is this massive thing that you don't understand, it really gets in your way of doing something very, very simple, right? Just changing a name, just changing a pronoun, right? It seems hard in our minds because we put so much on top of it, but actually it's the most important way that we show respect to people every single day. Practicing it is the way to get there, right? So even when the person isn't there, and really especially if the person isn't there, right? Because, you know, a person isn't a nice person if they're not nice to the person when they're not in the room, right? So let's be really clear that you have to keep practicing the pronoun. And, you know, if someone gets it wrong, it's not about shaming that person. The way that you do it, if someone's using the wrong name or pronoun for someone who's just transitioned on the job, for instance, all you have to do is lead by example. Oh, wait, are we talking about Christine? Yeah, she said that she was going to be here at 2 o'clock, right? Like you simply just move forward, because when we shame people, and especially when people feel bad about it, this is brain science. When you feel bad about something, you can't learn it. So just keep on practicing it, keep on correcting people, be kind, recognize that everybody's in a transition together, but you do have to get there. And in fact, you have to get there pretty quickly, because continuing to dead name a person, which is using the name that they no longer use, it's called dead naming, or misgendering a person, which is using the wrong pronouns, very quickly, again, under employment law in California and in several other states, becomes harassment. If you make a mistake, when you make a mistake, right, just fix it and move forward. Think about it like if you've ever misgendered somebody's dog, right? Oh, she's so cute. Oh, no, actually, this dog's a boy. Oh, he's so cute, right? You don't even think about it. You don't feel bad because it's just a dog. Nobody's feelings are hurt, right? Some people might find it surprising that I'm saying, yeah, just treat trans people like you would treat a dog that you misgendered, right? That's really where we are. And that should tell you something about where we are. But a little bit, it's that you acknowledge your mistake, right? You've used the wrong pronoun. Oh, I'm so sorry. You fix it. She said she'd like the papers on her desk by Friday, right? And then you move on, and you have to do better. Once you know better, you do better. You practice, you do better. Don't make a big thing about it. Again, that puts negativity into it. It stops everybody from learning. And for the trans person or the non-binary person, it puts this whole thing of feeling insult to injury on top of it by drawing so much more attention, right? So simply correct yourself, you know, be accountable to it. I apologize, fix it, and move forward. No big deal. What we're trying to do is, you know, you may have seen a lot of things on social media, for instance, where they're asking people now to put their pronouns. Here on Zoom, you can put your pronouns on Zoom. You can put them in your email signature, for instance. Why would we be doing that? Well, it's because what we're trying to do is normalize it. We're trying to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing their pronouns, so that the people who need to share their pronouns, because otherwise you wouldn't know, specifically people who use they, them pronouns, or people who don't look like they use she, her, or he, him pronouns, right? Those folks don't have to get over this huge mountain of courage and bravery and all of these things just to simply be talked to as a person in the workplace, right? So if you do it, if you're a cisgender person, and this is not something you ever generally think about, but you take the time and you're conscientious enough to add your pronouns to your email signature, your name tag, right? Any of those things, That's really going to help us create the equitable playing field that we're going for. Soon it becomes normal, and then we can move on to the next thing, right? So it's not so much of a big deal. Now, one thing I do want to say is some people don't like sharing their pronouns, and for good reason. I like to think about many cisgender women that I know who are of a certain age, right? Who have lived through sexism in a really intense way. I know so many cisgender women, particularly artists, who have made their names like AP, Smith, right? They've made their names genderless in a way so that they don't experience the brunt of sexism. You could add to that people who may be going through a transition themselves, maybe who don't know yet what pronoun they want to use, right? These are all really valid reasons for not wanting to share your pronouns, right? And it's not that you're anti-trans, right? It's not that you're being phobic in any kind of way. We do have to give people some grace for this, but at the same time, recognize that when you do choose to share your pronouns, it's really helpful to the larger movement that we're all a part of. We're all part of a new gender revolution. People who lived through the 60s and 70s, you were a part of a gender revolution. This is the same thing. Different time, second verse, same as the first, right? This is all happening, and if we all participate in it, we can get through it much less painfully, right? And we can find out where else we need to go. So how can you do this if you're not sure of what someone's pronoun is? If you're not sure if someone's pronoun is, or if you want to just be supportive, you start with yourself. Hey, my name's Scott. I use he and they pronouns. I want to make sure that I'm respecting you. What pronouns do you use? You could also start meetings with new people by starting and saying, hey, my name's Scott. I use he and they pronouns. I'm the associate producer on this movie. And today we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z, right? And that way, I, as the leader, by sharing my pronouns, I make it clear for everyone in the group that anyone who needs to share their pronouns can. I'm not going to require that everybody goes through it, but I'm standing in solidarity, hey, unions, right? Standing in solidarity with folks who have to get over this extra hump. And if you think it's hard to share a pronoun, imagine what it's like to be someone who has to share a pronoun. Maybe that can help you kind of find a place of compassion, right? Where you want to do this because it's a good and helpful thing to do. And by the way, we used this thing a while ago, this thing on preferred pronouns and preferred names, probably 10 years ago. This is where we started with HR by saying, what pronoun do you prefer? Using the word prefer, it gives you the impression that there's a choice. People just use the pronouns that they use. People use the name that they use. There's nothing preferred about it. So you can just say, what pronouns do you use? I want to make sure I respect you. What pronouns do you use? As we already talked about, we use they, them, their pronouns all the time, right? Nick really said this very well, so I'm going to kind of not go so deep into it. One thing I want to say is some people really get resistant to this and they spout off about how it's not correct grammar, which unfortunately has been completely disproven given that all of the English style guides and dictionaries agree that you can use they, them to refer to a singular person. So you're being grammatically incorrect when you're complaining that it's grammatically incorrect. But what you're also showing is that you're resistant to the identity in the first place. It's not transphobia, but it's on the way to, it's on the same side as, okay? So I get that change is hard, right? We don't want, we don't like to have to think about a new thing. Everything's hard in life already, right? But let's not take it out on the people who are going through something that's very hard themselves. Some people will use they and he. As I mentioned, I use he and they pronouns because I'm one of those transgender people who also identifies as non-binary. Right? What that means when we say that is you can use either one. So if you look at me and it's easier for you to call me he, that's cool. Because you know what? I was born female, right? I was assigned female at birth. You are still acknowledging and respecting me, right? If you want to use they, that's awesome. Because that means that, you're also recognizing a deeper part of me that's important to me, right? So you can use either one. And again, practice really makes perfect with this. I challenge you to turn on your TVs after we're done with this tonight and change the pronoun in your head. Talk about whatever protagonist is on the screen and go, they just pulled out a gun. They are running away from the cops. They are, right? Do they in your own head. And that is what will help you get more comfortable with this. Practice makes perfect. Now, pulling back, right? Actually using words for everybody right? We have to think about how we can be respectful to everybody in the workplace. I'll point out this idea about guys and folks, okay? So I can't tell you how many people roll their eyes when I say, actually, guys is not a gender neutral pronoun, especially Midwesterners. They're like, no, it absolutely is. They get very upset about this, okay? But I can't tell you how many female executives, cis women, come up to me after I've given this talk and say, thank you so much for bringing up that point about guys. It bothers me so much when someone walks into a room full of women and says, hey guys, I'm not a guy. None of us are guys, right? So actually there is a bit of cultural tension around this. Guys is one of those words. And it's really easy to replace it with a word like folks or friends, everybody, everyone, all, hey team. I could go on and on and on. That is how easy it is to not gender the word, right? So let's look at this, right? Instead of saying men or women, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, right? Esteemed guests, right? Teammates, his or her, theirs. We've gone into that quite a bit. And my favorite is if you're working in a crowd situation, just being really specific. So the person in the red shirt, right? That way you know that you're not getting it wrong and you're still being really accurate, right? So these are some ways that we can just think of to degender our language so that because we don't know how someone identifies, right? Because we're often working in diverse crowd situations with a lot of people together, fixing these words that we use all the time, replacing them with words that we still use all the time, right? Just giving it an extra bit of thought about it, that's really going to help us create this equitable playing field where we're all standing in solidarity with one another, right? And recognizing that this is a diverse workplace that we're in. So let's move to the set. I'm going to start with trans actors, first of all, because I'm an actor and you know actors, but also because this is where so much of this conversation has really become ignited. One thing that I really want to make clear is that this whole fight about trans actors playing trans roles isn't about acting, okay? It was actually about equitable career opportunities. And for folks who are in the union, you understand the importance of this, okay? When transgender people couldn't even play transgender roles, we couldn't get in the room at all to act at all. And that was systemic oppression. That was exclusion, right? For transphobic reasons, okay? So that's what that whole fight was about. And now we're moving beyond it. I myself just played a cisgender character on a TV show. Right now, as it becomes equal, now we can all really just be actors, right? But that was just the beginning. And what's important to recognize now that there's this flood of transgender actors who are coming to sets, right, is to recognize that some trans people have bodies that really differ from typical cisgender people's bodies, okay? There are many ways that this can happen. It's got to do with hairlines. It's got to do with what genitals you might expect, what secondary sex characteristics you might expect, right? What a voice might sound like. There are a lot of different ways that trans people can be slightly different, right? And for some of us, this causes a lot of pain and sensitivity, right? So it really requires for folks in the crew to recognize this and be sensitive to it. And again, to sort of have that attitude of, oh, that's different. Okay, cool. Let's move forward, right? As opposed to like, oh no, oh, and walking on eggshells, right? That's not anything we want, right? So we have to think about the departments that need to be sensitive to dealing with bodies that don't conform or may not conform to the sort of preconceived notions we have of what male and female bodies are, right? I do a 20-minute specialized training with all of these groups. So hair and makeup, costume designers and dressers, with sound technicians who are coming into close contact with trans people when they're miking them, stunt performers and coordinators, special effects, if you're doing prosthetics for someone, any kind of prosthetics, and you're getting really, intimate with a person's body, key PAs who are in really close proximity with talent, right? Second ADs who might be working with crowd control, right? Might be dealing with background artists and really kind of having to work in that way. Accounting and legal, right? And intimacy coordinators. So there are just all of these places where we really need to touch in and do kind of a deeper dive. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of do more work with locals. If you go ahead and look at the Costume Designers Guild's website, we did a really, really deep dive on this work together. And, I'm hoping that we can do more and more and more of that so that everybody gets this 20-minute specialized training and kind of knows what to do. But let's kind of pull back and look at the sort of crowd control idea of being on set. There's so many people. So first of all, we're just going to assume, like I said, we're going to open the frame and we're going to assume that there are trans and non-binary crew, actors, background artists, like anybody on set could be trans or non-binary. So another first thing that we're going to think about is, where do people use the restroom? I love sets because there's so many all gender restrooms. There's so many single stalls, porta potties, right? And actually it's a law in California and a few other states where any single stall restroom, so one of those places that just has a toilet, maybe a sink, right, has to be labeled all gender. I don't like the phrase gender neutral. All gender is much more to the point, and really there's nothing neutral about gender if you think about it, right? So let's make sure that there's as many of those spaces as possible around for people to access without having to ask where they are, right? And also in California and many other states, a person uses the bathroom that accords to their gender identity, whether or not they look how people typically think that people should look for going into a women's room or going into a men's room. If that's the case, right, no one should be policing who's going into the restroom. If someone's doing something wrong, and we all have a very clear idea of what is wrong to do in a restroom, if anyone is doing something wrong in a restroom, absolutely that's a problem. Call for help, make a big stink about it. But if someone is just using the restroom the way that we all know that you should, it doesn't matter what they look like, okay? That's what we have to get comfortable with in this changing world that we are all a part of. And I want to point out too, in dressing spaces, we've got, if we're thinking about, especially for background artists and crowd control, right? We've got a tent, right, for men and a tent for women. You need a third tent that's labeled all gender. And these are public, sort of more public changing spaces because they'll have, groups of people in them, okay? So there are many people, whether they are trans and non-binary or whether they're cisgender, who are perfectly comfortable taking their clothes off, especially performers, right? Getting changed in front of people, like it doesn't make a big difference to them. But there are many people who are cisgender and trans and non-binary who really, for matters that are deeply personal to them, need a safe space. So what we do on Euphoria is we have a star wagon. It's one of those 3-ups. We hold one of those spaces. And if anybody says, is there a private place where I can change? We can zip them in there. We say, hurry up, be quick about it, right? And then they can come right out. And that makes a safe space for everyone. Something really important to recognize is that there's a statistic, but I think it's like 60% at least of transgender people's identity cards don't match their real lived identity. Okay, so we have to recognize that someone might be handing you a driver's license with a different looking picture, a different name than you would expect, and a different gender marker than you would expect. And this becomes a situation of privacy. Okay, if whatever forms that you have to fill out, I've given you a picture here of sort of how forms should look. I'm really trying to work with people to help with, especially with productions, to get them to change their forms so that we recognize, here's the name on your ID, here's the name you go by. And the name you go by should be highlighted so that anyone, whether you're passing it off to accounting to get paid out that night, right? Any of those folks will know exactly who to call out, right? And how to respect that person. And if you even put their pronouns on there, then everybody has it and everybody knows, okay? You have to keep that private information, like what's on the driver's license, you have to keep that private, because if you yell, would John please come to the trailer to get paid, right? When Linda stands up, she's gonna feel very, very vulnerable, and it actually makes her really vulnerable in life, okay? So we have to recognize that keeping that information private and also making sure that everybody who communicates has the information they need to communicate respectfully, right? That's gonna be a best practice. I put this on here not because anyone has the power to hire trans consultants, though some of you may have the power to suggest that you bring a trans consultant in here, but because trans consulting and trans consultants are becoming more common on sets, it's something that I want all of you to think about how you in your job might interact with this person. Heidi Bivens, who's the costume designer on Euphoria, and I had a growth process together of learning, because we were in contact so very much around issues of what our trans and non-binary actors were wearing and what made the actors themselves feel okay enough, right? Versus what was needed for the character, right? And so Heidi and I realized, and she said, you know, this is so different. Like I've never had to talk to anybody else about this, but I'm really glad you're here because you're really helping me work some things out. I want to be respectful. I want everyone to feel comfortable, right? And so I taught her a bunch of things and she taught me a bunch of things as well. So just think about how might your position interact with someone like me, right? With a trans consultant who's there to be an advocate for anyone on set who's trans or non-binary, right? For someone who is there to help and be the person who can answer questions that you might have, right? Instead of thinking that just anybody on set who is trans is someone that you can go ask a trans question to, right? A trans consultant is actually that person whose actual job it is to be able to do that for you, right? Think about that because this is one of those new positions like intimacy coordinators where we interact a lot and we intersect a lot with different members in different departments. And we have to figure out like, what are our protocols going to be going forward and how are we going to interact? So that's what I've got. Here's where you can find us. And I'm going to bring Nick back on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we have time for your questions.
Yeah, and I want to say just briefly before we get into questions that Scott is such a wealth of knowledge. And at GLAAD, we're really lucky that we have him as a part-time trans consultant on both like scripts and storytelling and casting and these production issues, but we don't get him full-time because he has a booming career as an actor and also as a consultant. So you may sometimes see Scott on the set and he may have his GLAAD hat on and sort of be doing it for GLAAD, but also Scott may be there on his own for speaking of transgender, because GLAAD, honestly, as an organization, we are smaller on the inside than we look on the outside. We're like the opposite of the TARDIS. So we don't actually have all the bandwidth to embed with a show like Euphoria and be there 24/7 and help round up 300 trans extras for a party scene and all the things Scott has done, and for other shows as well. So we're really lucky. This is a GLAAD presentation, but Scott also does this work independently when GLAAD doesn't have the bandwidth to do a kind of in bed with a production and it might be shooting for 6 or 8 or 9 months if it's a TV show. So thank you, Scott, for all of that knowledge. I learned something about it every time he does it because I don't spend that much time on sets. And when I do, I'm bored witless. God bless all of you for the jobs that you do. So now we do have some time for questions. I appreciate you staying with us. I know we went a couple of minutes over. Are there any questions? And this is a small enough group that you can just ask them. But Nicole's going to have to allow you to unmute yourselves.
I was going to say, I don't know if Desi has any in the chat, but if not, we can unmute, or if you are aware of the hand raising function, either way is fine. Do you have any questions in your chat there?
Not yet, but if anyone's feeling shy, you can just message me and I can ask for you. But you can unmute if you have a question.
Yeah, for sure.
So we allowed that too.
It's also quiet.
I know. This is the bad part of Zoom is, you know, if one person will start with a question, then everybody will have a question. But until that first person is brave enough to ask a question, it's crickets.
I have a couple in the chat to me, I guess, or I don't know if you all can see them, but I'll go ahead and start with the first one that asks, what can we do to fight back against anti-trans laws?
Yes, that is a very good question. So this past 6 months, like I think I may have said, or maybe it's I dreamed it because out time means nothing. This was one of the most anti-trans state legislative sessions that we've been through since January to June, with all these anti-trans bills being introduced. And I think, you know, if you live in a state in which one of these bills is being introduced, then by all means, motivate your friends and family to go and speak at the state legislature, contact the state legislatures. It doesn't help really for people in California to contact legislatures in Arkansas because it just makes them more mad. But if you know friends and family in Arkansas who can reach out to their state legislators, that will help. And all of this is the conservative right wing's attempt to foment fear about who trans people are, to stop the Equality Act, which is something that should have passed through Congress 40 years ago or longer and hasn't. The Equality Act would create federal non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. And because it's currently stuck in the Senate, these state bills are a way of like whipping up the conservative base to make them angry about and scared of trans people, honestly, which then is a way of undercutting the Equality Act at the federal level and not getting it through the Senate. So weirdly, if you happen to live in California or New York or another state in which we have so many protections for trans people, I think the only reason that fear mongering works is because people think they don't know us. Honestly, the best thing that you can do is like talk to your friends and family members about this presentation, about shows you've seen with transgender characters, about disclosure. There's a documentary on Hulu, Hulu that just came on Hulu June 1st called Changing the Game. Our friend and coworker Alex Schmitter is a producer on that documentary. It's about transgender high school athletes, 4 of them. And they just get to talk about being themselves in their own words. You see that they're a high school kid, just like any other high school kid. And they're not the scary monsters that are being portrayed in these state legislatures where they're trying to ban trans girls from playing girls' sports. Watch Changing the Game and like talk to your friends about it, because I think as people realize that they do know us, that we are their friends, family members, and coworkers, they're not going to be able to, these anti-trans politicians are not going to be able to fear monger off of our lives the way they are now. Like their playbook right now around trans people is the same thing they did in the 80s and 90s about gay people. If you're old enough to think back, it was like, oh, gay people can't be teachers because they'll brainwash children. They can't be Boy Scout leaders because they're gay people are child molesters and pedophiles. Like all of that fear mongering worked against gay and lesbian people for so long because people thought they didn't know us. They're just repurposing the same old nonsense against trans people because people think they don't know us. None of it wasn't true back then. It's not true now. But as more people become familiar with who trans people are, it's gonna stop working. It's just gonna be ugly until we get through it and people realize, oh yeah, trans people are everywhere, you know? And that's why the power of storytelling in the media that you all help create is so important. Because if there's 1.4 million transgender Americans, like we could all go around and personally introduce ourselves to 360 Americans. It's going to take a long time. I don't have time. I'm old. I'm going to die before that would happen. So I just want like mass media to tell our stories more authentically in the films and TV shows that you are all working on, because those portrayals will change the hearts and minds of people who think they've never met us. And then those bills won't pass. And hopefully the violence and the poverty and the discrimination will decrease. I genuinely, truly believe that. And if I didn't, I wouldn't have worked at GLAAD for so long.
Okay, and next one is, you mentioned the confusion around the LGBT name. I've heard that gender and sexual minority, or GSM, could possibly replace that in the future. How much utility do you see in replacing the community's name?
Yeah, so it's GSM or whatever it was you said, I don't see so often, but there is another acronym. So in the United States, we say LGBTQ, and then sometimes there's an I and an A and a plus and a variety of other things. And I have another presentation where I could walk you through all those words. Because we keep trying to add on letters to try to encompass all the diverse identities within this community. And it gets, you know, so long that I think it alienates people. And in Europe, they tend to use this phrase, sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, S-O-G-I. And then you cover all the LGB of it all. And then the T is covered under gender identity, S-O-G-I. And so marginalized SOGI is one of the things you'll often see in Europe. And my coworker, Louise, she said, you know, it's like the metric system. It's like Europe's got the clean, neat, easy version. And the United States is still over here with like feet, inches, and yards, and like the LGBTQIA+. And you, in the federal government in the United States, you do occasionally see SOGI. They'll use it, especially if it's something to do with the United Nations or something where they're talking internationally. But it's so unknown here in the United States. I can't imagine that we're going to switch to it anytime soon. I swear, when I work on the new version of the Media Reference Guide this summer, I'm going to include SOGI as something like maybe we start pushing people to use, because ultimately there's no number, there's no amount of letters is going to be capable of naming every single one of the diverse sexual orientation and gender identities underneath this huge LGBTQ umbrella. But it's just, SOGI is just very, very unknown here. I wish we used it more, to be honest.
I have a question from the chat. It's what are the actions, procedures a person should do when experiencing or witnessing harassment?
That's a good one. I'm gonna let Scott answer that one. Oh boy.
Well, so first of all, it's really important to recognize, don't ever make yourself unsafe, right? We've had too many instances where people have done the heroic, wonderful thing of stepping in and have gotten really badly hurt, whether that's through violence or through other means. So the first thing is stay safe. But the second thing is document it as soon as possible, right? And recognizing and saying, if something is to happen, we'll just say with a trans person, we'll just make up an example, and you're in the room and someone's dead naming and misgendering that person, and you don't feel comfortable. Let's say it's a studio executive. Let's say it's somebody with a lot of power who has power over your job, right? And you don't feel safe sort of standing up in that moment. For you to go after that, after it's happened, to that person that it's happened to, and to say, I saw that happen, I'm gonna come with you to report it, right? Like, that's a really amazing act of allyship, because so many of us are taught that we're a problem, it's our fault because our genders are different, and what do we expect, and blah, 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 blah. Like, we expect to be treated fairly and equally on the job, just like everybody else does, right? So when somebody comes up and says, I saw that too, I'm on your side with this, I'm gonna deliver a statement, right? That's a really incredibly powerful act. Let's say the person isn't in the room. And let's say, again, maybe that you've tried it. As I said, you don't want to shame somebody, right? But say somebody's, calling, Linda John, and rolling their eyes about how, John, I mean Linda, I mean John, or whatever, right? Like, you may have experienced this, right? In that situation, again, you can do the modeling it by leadership by saying, are you talking about Linda? Cool. So Linda, she is blah, 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 right? Like, you can just model it yourself without shaming or making it a big deal. If they continue to persist and are, being rude about it, that's a moment where you have to document it, right? So you put it in an email, and the question then I have to turn back around to IATSE, because I want to know what's the best way that folks within the union, who should they email about situations like that? Who should they contact? What's the chain of command for reporting an incident of harassment?
Just an open question.
Yeah,
I think you want to
Yeah,
take.
neither Scott nor I know, so you guys have to answer it.
Off the top of my head, it's our like HR, basically our producers. Am I correct? Who can back me up on this? Who has better information?
Randy, brave.
There's HR. Yeah. So
hey, all right.
yeah.
Unmute yourself, Randy, so we can hear you.
Whatever I said was brilliant, though. Just wanted to make sure the business representative was working on Sunday. The IATSE safety hotline does take calls of discrimination. And then once the call is made to the IATSE safety hotline, it is referred to the business representative of the IA local, of the person who's making the complaint. Then I get on the phone with them, find out what the issue is. And in an issue in a workplace like this, where it's gender, a gender issue, we would put them in touch with HR, and they are well equipped to handle it within the workplace. We don't try to arbitrate it ourselves, and we can't fight it really with a grievance, because it's not necessarily a violation of the contract, even though the contract does stipulate there shall be no discrimination in the workplace.
And it's,
So,
where the tricky
ahead,
stuff
Scott.
comes in, right? No, this is where it gets tricky around for any gender stuff, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I will say, it's been I've been at GLAAD a very long time, and I often say that speaking Hollywood is my second language. Like, speaking trans is my first language, but I've gotten very, very, very fluent in speaking Hollywood just because I've been doing it for so long. But there's always some new part of the industry that I'm discovering, like every single year, where I'm like, oh, I didn't know that existed. So production HR is my new, most recent in the past couple of years. They've come to me from Netflix, from NBCU, from Viacom CBS, from the ABC Disney. And they seem to be the ones who are really, really, really interested in talking to me about doing this sort of production training for shows that have usually transgender or series regular actors who are going to be on set all the time. And one of the things we've learned, and this is not part of the formal presentation, but just so you guys know, is that Scott and I both have done these presentations for shows often at the beginning of production, when they get the sexual harassment training and all your other like pre-production kind of respecting the workplace trainings that you're getting. And what happens is that what we've learned is that, 6 weeks later, the script supervisor changes, Or this is an episodic that has a different director for every episode, and nobody bothers to give that director the news that that actor uses they, them pronouns. So when that happens and there's problems because the pre-production training on gender in the workplace and how to gender actors correctly, et cetera, it's not a perfect solution. It's a definite step in the right direction and people get the information they need to be respectful. But how do we keep it going throughout the course of a 6 or 9 month shoot for a series and onboard people with that information when they come in new to the set, so they don't get on a microphone and look at some actor who uses they, them pronouns and say, can she move like a foot to the left, which has happened. So when we have to solve these problems, it is the production HR team that often comes to me to figure out like, oh, this is an ongoing issue on the set. Something is not right, it's not being communicated properly. What are we going to do to fix it so that everybody can just come to work and be gendered correctly all the time, every day? Because, you know, that accidentally using the wrong pronoun for someone, it might seem like nothing to you or minor, like, well, I just did it once. Like, it's just, you know, but the thing about microaggressions, which is what using the wrong pronoun for someone is repeatedly, is that it builds up over time. So, you know, if there's an actor or a person on set who uses they, them pronouns, and you accidentally forget their pronoun one time and you do what Scott said, which is stop, apologize, correct yourself, and move on quickly, you might think, oh, that was no big deal. But you might have been the 40th person that day to use the wrong pronoun for that person because a set is a big place and people are busy. And that sort of microaggression builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up. And it really does grind on the mental health of the person just trying to come to work and like do their best job. And that includes actors and that includes people in the crew as well. So if people aren't getting the message, or if new people are coming on and they're not even told, so they can't do the right thing, Scott and I are both right now are sort of brainstorming with a lot of production HR people, and maybe now also working more closely with IATSE to figure out like, how do we like keep this consistent over the long term when you have trans people on set, to make sure that people get the training initially early on and they know that what they need to do, but how can we keep it consistent over the whole course of the time that this show or this film is in production? And that's a little bit of a tricky problem we haven't quite solved. And we certainly don't understand the union reporting side of it. And it would be helpful for us going forward to know more about that on that side as well.
But yeah, to succinctly answer the question, there's a way to do it through the union, and there's a way to do it if there's a production HR. Either one of those things will hopefully bring a resolution. And also, if there's a trans consultant on set, that's another way, another person that you can bring that to, who will know how to get the wheels moving in the ways that they need, and he can address it really directly.
I see a raised hand from Miranda.
Yeah, hi, Miranda here, she, they. I just wanted to ask if GLAAD, I understand that, you know, the harassment process is a process that goes through the union or goes to HR, but does GLAAD have any resources that they can share for just sort of the sensitivity training part of that we can sort of offer to our locals if they're getting these calls or if they're getting harassment cases that are coming in? That would be my first question, if you have resources to offer like that. And then also, I would love to see a trans training, or, you know, like we get sexual harassment training, there's diversity trainings that happen through contract services, but I think we need a trans training through contract services also.
Is contract services a union thing?
It's actually the producer's side of things. So, you know, but it's a general contract, and maybe Randy can speak to this better than I can, but it's contract services is the producer's side of trainings that that happen to almost that every crew member usually have to go through if they're on a TV show or sometimes on film. So we've all had sexual harassment training, but there is very little sensitivity to any kind of trans representation in that training whatsoever. So I would love to see that happen at the contract service level. I don't know if that's something GLAAD can look into or partner with or whatever.
Yeah, we're certainly in this space of, you know, everything's transitioning in this way. So that's a really great suggestion. And I think too, you know, I do talk about this and often give trans sensitivity trainings at the top, like during a pre-production meeting when everybody's there for the sexual harassment training, right? So that's just what we're starting to do. We're right on the cusp of you know, making a process. And so I think that will be happening here pretty soon. And as we make that process, I think this, the direct lines to how do we address harassment and discrimination really specifically will also become clear. So the answer is no, we don't have those resources yet, but they're coming.
And this I want to say this talk is being recorded and is going to be made available for IASTE membership to watch going forward. So this will be like a digital education tool that you guys can use for the next at least 6 months. We didn't want to make it permanent because this is a constantly changing thing. Again, I say when we talk about this 6 months from now or a year from now, we may say different stuff and we may have different relationships with the industry that we can talk about. So we didn't want to make it like permanent, but it's, you know, we're going to use it for the next several months. And I think that, you know, media companies and producers' interest in that kind of trans contract service training sort of thing at the beginning of production, it varies between, like, if they have a trans series regular, like let's do Why the Last Man, for example, which had Elliot Fletcher on set as a series regular transgender character, transgender actor. They wanted 3 trainings back to back to back for like all cast, all crew, because he was going to be there, you know, for months in almost every single scene. Euphoria, which has not only trans characters, but like really intense, deep trans themes and trans storytelling, had Scott like on set all of the time to help with so many of the aspects of that. But then you have, like, if you're going to have a show that has 2 episodes and it's like it's a trans actor coming in to do a guest star thing, and they're only going to be shooting maybe 4 days. Nobody wants to spend time in pre-production doing an hour-long training, and nobody wants, and I've tried, and it's very difficult while the show is in production, to get everybody in one place and do a training at lunch, because that involves extending lunch 30 minutes, which involves money. And I have had shows do that, but it's very difficult once the whole train is in motion to call it to a halt and get another training just because we're about to have 4 days of trans content on set. And then again, while Scott and I are constantly talking about, hey, it's not just your actors, hey, it's not just your actors, that's still where people's focus is. They want the actor to have good experiences on set with costumes and hair and makeup and other cast members and the crew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're not often thinking about the fact that they have trans and non-binary crew. They do, they definitely do. And so we want to help them realize that, you know, it's not just about what's in front of the camera, it's also about the fact that your workplace behind the camera is also getting more gender diverse every day. And I don't know, you know, if the union collects demographic information about its membership. If it does, I have like best practices for how to capture that information about like who's trans and non-binary, because often the question is asked in a way that doesn't really get at the right answer. But, you know, I think as SAG-AFTRA starts to collect information demographically about its union members, and people are looking also to hire, like now there are productions who say, like Disclosure, for example, had an entirely trans and non-binary crew. And when they couldn't find a trans or non-binary person to fulfill a certain crew role, they hired a cisgender person to do it and set up a mentorship program to give a trans or non-binary person some training in that skill set. So we're also seeing more requests for diversity behind the camera as well in terms of gender diversity. And like, how do you find those people is really an open question. So I don't leave GLAAD because all of these problems are so interesting and so much of a challenge to solve. It's like a puzzle every day, like how to make this industry better, and it's very fun. Miranda, I saw your hand go up again and then go down again. Did you want to chime in with another question?
No, actually, thank you. That was actually just me clapping at the training,
okay.
the training of you know, other trans crew members coming up, which I think is awesome. I just did want to say that I do really appreciate the training that goes into the productions that are trans sensitive, but I really believe that this should be a training, like, you know, entertainment wide, and that's what contract services does. So hopefully we'll get there. But anyway,
there is one example that I
continue.
know, because I work with the person at NBCU who does their respect in the workplace trainings every time something's about to go into production. And she, for example, now has 2 or 3 slides in the middle where she talks about pronouns. And it's not anywhere near as in-depth as what Scott and I just did. It is literally just a few questions. But in talking to her, she's spoken to me about how even those few slides about pronouns in the workplace on a production has sparked people to come out to her as trans and non-binary, to talk about, like, for example, the situational respect. So a writer may get gendered correctly in the writer's room where everyone knows them, but then when that writer has to walk out onto the set because their episode that their name is on is being shot, now they're interacting with 300 people on that set who don't even know that that writer uses they, them pronouns. And how can the production go about sharing that information so that whether you're respected, your gender is clearly seen and respected, doesn't depend on which room you're sitting in. She's thinking those things through and bringing up the pronoun question, and her typical respect in the workplace training is sparking a lot of that conversation and dialogue. So yeah, I think we're going to start to see media companies begin to sprinkle this gender diversity information into the kind of typical trainings that they do. But they are not, those trainers are mostly not trans either. So they need to figure out a way to bring some of that competency to what they're doing, even when it's not a show that's going to have like a series regular trans actor on the front of the camera. Elliot Page is #1 on the call sheet for Umbrella Academy. Like, even when it's not that, how can we make this a more just part of what everybody does when they get ready to go into production on a film or a TV show?
So thank you. I'm getting some comments and things that I can share. There's a website that somebody sent me, transonset.com. And if you like, I can paste that for copy paste for everyone. And I think it's a lot of expanding on what you've already said. Randy mentions that people also above the line need the training. And as you all know, I work in a totally different jurisdiction at a theme park, but so many of this stuff is very similar in so many ways. We work with Teamsters, we work with everybody in all kinds of capacities, and this is something we've been talking more and more about as well. So a lot of it is still applicable. But yeah, so there is a question. I have an issue with, when actors, performers are referred to as children, the girls, the boys, how does one address this?
Kids.
Maybe, yeah.
Kids.
It's similar to when you were talking about the guys part, maybe, huh?
Yeah. The favorite thing I heard about the word guys recently, when men try to say that guys is not gendered, then you can ask a straight man, how many guys have you slept with, and see what his response is. He'll very quickly tell you that he has not slept with any guys.
But it's a gender neutral term.
There we go.
And I am totally like I commit that crime I constantly say guys. I think it is a Midwestern thing. I don't think of guys as a gendered term, but I'm trying to get better at not using that term when it's a mixed group of people, for sure. But yeah,
it's not a hill we have to die on. It's just that place of awareness.
Like, think about it.
Right? Like, let's just take a breath and go, oh, right, how could I proceed with more awareness and sensitivity? We don't have to fight about it. Guys.
Yeah.
But kids for sure. And anytime, it's just weird when you think about the ways in which we line people up by genders as if there's only two. Mm-hmm. And I think if you take anything away from this presentation, it's that there are far more than two genders, and people think about their gender in very complex ways. And that, weirdly, this isn't new. There was a long, 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 long history of gender diversity throughout the world, but we had a very specific period of time of colonialism in the West going into a lot of countries and either criminalizing that behavior or wiping it out entirely. And so when it's not new or young or Western or college educated or just American or anything else, it's more like a rediscovery of the gender diversity that was really there all along. But it is something that we're all going to have to get used to dealing with again, because we've kind of forgotten it through the 1950s America, Leave It to Beaver world. That was the anomaly, not the fact that people have very, very complex and diverse thoughts about their gender and express their gender in such a multiplicity of ways. And honestly, that is what is so beautiful about it to me. But it does require us to learn new things and just be a little bit more intentional about how we talk to and about people, and really listen to them when they're telling us, oh, I use she and they pronouns. What does that mean? You know, if you don't mind telling me. Like, this is one of those things where if they like, oh, somebody's just taking a 5-minute break on set to grab a bite, something from the craft services table, and you roll up to them and say, you use she, they pronouns. Tell me all about that. Like, when did you know? When did you figure it out? What did your parents say? That's not the time or place necessarily, but you know, it's just like, oh, okay, use she, they pronouns. And then if you're having a beer after work and they feel like telling you more about their lived experience of that, that's great, you know? So I think, I'm sure that everybody on this call is that type of person who wants to be like professional in the workplace and then also open to learning more about someone when they say they use she, them pronouns, she and they pronouns. What does that mean to you? And it's just going to be so much more the wave of the future.
Mhm. And you made me think of, and when you were talking earlier about the 3 lines and masculine, feminine, male, female, all of that. And I thought about how even how we see things like our expression, our clothes that we wear. And now, you know, you have an actor walking down the red carpet wearing a dress, and then we may think that that's non-binary, but what if as a female, I'm wearing pants? How is that, you know, the double standard there? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And I'm not even sure if I'm asking a question about it. It's more just what
No,
is.
it is a really good question, because when you deviate from what is considered appropriately masculine for a man or appropriately feminine for a woman, I said before that society lets you know about it. Like, those rules are enforced and you sort of know how much you can get away with. But simply violating the rules of masculinity and femininity in terms of your gender expression, that doesn't inherently make you trans. I mean, Katharine Hepburn wore pants, and Marlene Dietrich in a tux, and Billy Porter on a red carpet at the Oscars in that fabulous gown. Billy doesn't even use the word non-binary to describe himself. Like, Billy's just a gay man who has a feminine gender expression. Great. But then if Jonathan Van Ness was standing right next to Billy Porter, also in a dress, Jonathan Van Ness would say, oh, I'm non-binary and I use they, them pronouns. What is the difference? Only they know, you know what I mean? Like, only they could tell you why Billy doesn't use the word non-binary and Jonathan does, and it's important to Jonathan to use that word. But yeah, the woman right next to both of them, standing there in a fabulous, you know, pair of pants from Chanel or whatever, nobody even thinks twice about that, because there's a little bit more wiggle room because of patriarchy for women to dress in masculine ways, as long as it's like, you know, considered sexy and attractive and so on and so forth. But a man in a dress, like, everything stops, you know, everything. It's like the needle on the record. What? How could that possibly be? And it just shows like how rigid our thinking is about gender expression, like, let alone gender identity. You know, it's like even gender expression is so rigidly enforced for people, especially people assigned male at birth. There's not
And
any
again,
room for them to wear fingernail polish or anything.
100%, right?
Expanded on that so well. Thank you.
And so, yeah, it's really just about sort of saying, cool, what's next?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, that's
Yeah.
all of this activism, all of this expertise is just to get everybody else to just go, cool.
Yeah, I cannot
next?
wait actually for the
You
day
know?
in which someone like Elliot Page can say that they're trans and non-binary, and the world goes, great, when's season 3 of Umbrella Academy coming out? Like, that's my dream, actually, is not to have the cover of Time magazine and not to have an Oprah interview. But we need that right now because people are still so unsure about us. But in the same way today, famous people can say they're gay and lesbian, bisexual, and you might get a little headline here or there, and you might not, because everybody's like, oh yeah, another LGBT famous person. I long for the day when we can have people share, and all they're really telling you is that your gender identity is not what their gender identity is not what you assumed it was. And when we can get to that place where the reaction is like, okay, cool, thanks for telling me. Now, how far have you gotten along on this checklist of things we need to do before cameras start rolling on Monday? And that's it. That's all we'd really like, honestly. It's going to take some work to get there, but I've already seen so much change happen in that regard. I was going to say, since I started working at GLAAD in 1998, but honestly, the change started in 2013 with Orange is the New Black. And that was that moment where I felt like the world woke up and realized that, oh, transgender people are not flat one-dimensional stereotypes, and someone like Laverne Cox can play that trans character. Great. And since then, the world has changed so much. So I'm really excited about the future, especially as Gen Z and millennials get their hands on the control of everything, because I think things are going to change a lot.
Right, those statistics were very interesting, where you had the generational breakdowns. So I want to go back to something you said earlier to be sure not to forget. We do have some locals I'm aware of that are conducting demographic surveys of sorts. So if you have examples or anything you can provide, I would imagine some would appreciate that. And we do have
Yeah.
a DEI committee at the international level, a diversity, equity, inclusion committee. And I'm not a part of that committee, so I'm not going to say exactly what they're working on, but they may find that helpful as well.
Yeah, afterwards I'll send you a PDF that has like, oh, if you're trying to capture information about sexual orientation and gender identity, here's some ways in which you can do it. That will allow people to self-identify in ways that are most authentic and accurate.
Excellent, thank you. Desi, do you have anyone else in the chat? I don't think any further questions at the moment.
That's all the questions I had.
Okay.
I'm losing my light, and we've already kept you here 20 or 90 minutes, so I really longer even. And so I appreciate that you all have stayed. Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for inviting us to chat.
Thank
you so much for being here. Thank you.
All
right, thanks everybody.
Thank you in the chat.
Happy Sunday. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.